And I would love to talk about how psychedelics have helped you, but before we get there, I would love to visit OCD and help our listeners kind of understand what this feels like. Your monologue was extremely helpful for people like us who don't have OCD, or at least not a palpable version enough to be diagnosed, but I loved the scene of you acting out crossing the streets. One side
Ah,
had the sun shining and one side had the trees, and you were like, oh, maybe I have OCD because I don't have enough vitamin D, but I need nature.
right.
And just this incessant crossing of the streets. And, I saw a lot of indecisiveness that came with your OCD. And I saw a lot of, like, you didn't have so much of the OCD of double checking things. At least you
Mhm.
didn't express that in your mushroom cure, but what are some of the nuances and specificities within your condition just to help people sympathize or empathize with you?
Yeah, I think all OCD, I view OCD really as above all an addiction where, and I would define an addiction broadly speaking as a behavior that is engaged in to avoid pain, but that behavior itself actually creates more pain, which in turn drives more of the addictive behavior. It's the classic vicious cycle. The worse you feel, the more you do OCD. The more you do OCD, the worse you feel. But the caveat there is, like all addictions, there is a little bit of very short term payoff some of the time. So, someone who you mentioned, like people who check, let's say someone who checks the stove because they're worried they left the stove on and they're worried that they're going to burn down their house and murder all their neighbors. It's because there's often that sort of catastrophic magnification of fear that happens with OCD. So when that person checks the stove again, they'll often feel a little bit of relief, very subtle, and maybe it only lasts 5 or 10 seconds, but they do get that little hit of relief, but then it wears off. So they check again to try to get more relief. And the problem is that, first of all, the relief doesn't last. But second of all, the more you engage, the more this person, to use this example, checks the stove, their anxiety actually starts to escalate because in addition to the anxiety of, oh, maybe I left the stove on, there's now the anxiety of, oh, shoot, I'm an hour late to work. I might get fired. Oh no, my relationship, my marriage is falling apart because I spend 5 hours a day in front of the stove checking the stove, and all of those things, those real world consequences of OCD, in turn drive more anxiety. And people with OCD, OCD is kind of our bottle. It's our drug of choice. So when you're in pain, when you're anxious, someone who has OCD, they're going to engage in OCD behavior to try to feel better, even if the source of their anxiety or pain is a real world problem. And so that just drives more of this whole vicious cycle. And that's why OCD, it has a pretty poor prognosis in terms of conventional treatment. Medication, about half of people with OCD don't respond to any medication. The half who do typically see only about a 25% symptom reduction. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a little bit better, but even there, if you really parse the data, only about a quarter of people see like really significant relief with therapy. Many people see some relief, but most people, the overall picture is most people with OCD, they continue to suffer. There may be some improvement, but they continue to suffer even if they avail themselves of conventional treatments. And I think that's just because it's real. Once you get trapped in this addictive cycle where the thing that you do to make yourself feel better actually makes you feel worse, it's very hard to escape that. And addictions across the board are notoriously difficult to treat. We think of addictions as substances, and obviously those can be devastating. But in I have not struggled with substance use disorders, but I know people who have and also have OCD, and they will generally say, man, quitting heroin was tough, but OCD is a lot tougher because with heroin, I had to call my guy. I had to go to the corner to score it. Or if I'm an alcoholic, I had to go into the bar. But OCD, the drug, it's between my ears. It's in my brain. So that makes it all the more difficult. You can't just separate yourself. An alcoholic can say, I'm just not going to pick up a drink. It's damn hard to do that. I'm not saying that's easy. It may be impossible for many people at many times, but it's theoretically something you can do. but I can't say, well, I'm just not going to make decisions since my OCD focused on decision making. Someone else with contamination fear can't say, well, I'll just never wash my hands. I just won't go into the bathroom. So it's like with OCD, we have to pick up the drug of choice a certain number of times a day and yet somehow not get caught. And that's why I think for most people, it's just really, 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 really hard to find real freedom from OCD. And so for me, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, it was mostly decision making. But that in and of itself, I would say, is also kind of a form of checking. Someone who's afraid they've left the stove on, they're checking to make sure the stove is off. Someone who has contamination fear, they're checking to make sure they're perfectly clean. For me, it was more this internal checking. Did I make the right decision? Maybe I didn't make the right decision. Maybe I should change my decision. Oh, no, I should walk on the other side of the street so I get enough vitamin D. No, wait, that doesn't feel right. Let me cross back over. So I think checking whether it happens internally in one's mind or externally in the physical reality is a common element of OCD. So that's, yeah, a little bit of how I view OCD.